Kia ora everyone, welcome to this Fabian session. I'm Philip. I'm delighted to welcome tonight two speakers, Adrian who's here in person and David Frame who'll join us shortly on screen. Better ways to do climate policy. Adrian was Vice Chair, then Chair of the negotiations in 2010 that established the Kyoto Protocol. He's an adjunct professor now at the New Zealand Climate Change Research Institute. David, you'll know, is Professor of Climate Change at the University of Canterbury, and he's been a lead author on the 5th and the 6th assessment reports of IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I have to have it written down. And over to you, Adrian. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Okay, kia ora tātou. Thank you, Philip. We've picked a slightly broader title for this opening bit compared, I think, with what was in the information. My sense was it would be quite useful just to spend a bit of time tossing around climate change itself as an issue and see how it's sort of been framed by people over the years. Because I think it's, if you ask, what I often do when we're having if we're doing a lecture, say, to a science class, start off by saying, just think you've got a 12-year-old who's asked you, well, what's the problem with climate change and what do we need to do to fix it? And the challenge is to come up with 2 sentences, plain English, which answer that question from the 12-year-old. And people find it very difficult. People cannot come up with short sentences, and B, how they express the problem, how they see the problem is really is hugely diverse. So it's a little bit the theme I wanted to start with. So the idea with Dave and me was that I would start on that more general stuff, and then we'll focus in on more the science side. So Dave will get to the nitty-gritty with the aid of some atmospheric physics, but no jargon, of where he, as a scientist, sees the issue. Dave, I should also say, has worked as a public official, and he's also got qualifications in philosophy, including ethics, which are rather relevant to the climate change discussion. So, and then we would bring it after those two, and he'll talk a bit about, mine will be a bit of a segue towards the New Zealand situation, but he'll talk a bit about New Zealand, and then we'll get on to, I've described it simply as the $30 billion issue, and this is a little bit what we've been writing about, Dave and I, recently, the public policy aspects of how New Zealand has reached its international climate change contribution, and that I thought that probably as a discussion, more like a conversation than a presentation. For anyone who's interested in our thoughts on that issue in more depth, we've written a series for Patrick Smelly's Business Desk. There's a series of 5 articles which came out a few weeks ago, covering a bit of the history of New Zealand's climate positions and a bit of a diagnosis of where we got, and some suggestions about whether there'd be things we could do better. Right, well, let's see if we can... Right, now you've heard you would presumably, most of you, all of you, would have heard the news from the latest COP. Oh, there's Dave there, is he? But Sharm el-Sheikh. This was COP 27. Just a quick question, does anybody, how many people know what a COP is? About half. Okay, so the COP is simply Conference of the Parties. Under a treaty, you generally have an annual conference or a biannual conference of the members of the treaty, and that's all that the COP is. Goes back to the Climate Convention, 1992, and we're up to COP 27. So a cynical view would be, this is our 27th attempt to save the planet and fail at it. Right. What you hear about COPs is not necessarily very close to the reality, but we'll get onto that. Now here's Ban Ki-moon. He made climate change a real feature of his tenure. Time for evacuation is over, science is clear, climate change is happening, impact is real. Unless we act, there'll be serious consequences, and he goes through the list. 2007. Well, we didn't really get very far until 2015, and finally there was a success. I presume everybody has heard of the Paris Agreement, which is the new climate agreement. It is a universal agreement. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, unlike the convention, all countries now are expected to reduce emissions. We have for the first time a temperature target, which is to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and towards 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Another important concept is that how you do it, you must reach a balance, what they call a balance of sources and sinks. What exactly that means is subject to different views, but roughly it means you need to stop if you've got sources of greenhouse gas emissions and sinks to mop some of them up or all of them up, you're no longer warming the planet. So net zero is roughly what we're saying. And there's other features of Paris, much more recognition of the need for assistance to developing countries on adaptation, a strong recognition of the need for finance. I mean, one of the problems of this negotiation all through has been that back in 1992, the world was divided into developing, rich and poor. And unfortunately, that paradigm has continued on through the negotiations and has been a massive constraint on making progress. I won't go into the details why, but we can in Q&A if you want. The rich-poor thing means that there is still a huge expectation on the part of many of the developing countries in that negotiation that we want to see more from you rich countries, it's your responsibility. And you'll note that the feature of the last COP was this loss and damage, which has been, it's a political win, and it's been expressed as finally the rich countries have agreed to pay these countries who've had damage and can't really adapt to climate change, the small island states and others. That's how it's been portrayed. But think about that. China's GDP, since that list was established, and China wants to be part of that developing country list, the poor country list, their GDP between 1992 and this year has gone up 3,330%. So there are many, many countries under the poor developing side who are way, way wealthier than a lot of the OECD countries, which is a real challenge for the negotiations, and Paris managed to overcome that. Let's step forward to COP27. What did the UN Secretary General Guterres say? Greenhouse emissions keep growing, global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We're on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. Now, those two comments were a long, long time apart, but so similar. This is Greenpeace's effort quite a few years ago too. Theme, time is running out. This is I think, round about the late 2000s. The way these people see the problem, it's up to the rich countries to pay that climate debt. And it's more or less what James Shaw was saying in Sharm el-Sheikh, that, well, we benefited from the Industrial Revolution, time to pay something back. So there they were in, I think it might 2007, I'm not quite sure. And here we are, 2022, Sharm el-Sheikh, same message being promulgated by largely Western NGOs. When I give our talks to RAFEs and other classes, I always quote, well, I make two quotes. One from Australian advisor Ross Garnaut to the Australian government saying climate change is a diabolical policy problem. But then the second quote I give is from Mikhail Kalashnikov, who was interviewed a few years before his death and asked what was the secret of this weapon that he produced, this rifle. It worked, deserts, oceans, everywhere, incredibly reliable. And he said, everything that is necessary, or everything that was necessary was kept simple. And that point, nothing more necessary than dealing with climate change, but there's a real challenge in how you actually express the core of the problem, how you actually simplify the problem. And there are many different ways of doing it. This is another one from this year. Pay up. Rich countries pay up effectively. if you're a demographer, the evidence is absolutely clear, and probably Len would agree with that correlation. So, huge correlation of greenhouse gas emissions and population. Solution, population policy. If you're left-wing leaning, it's capitalism, the exploitation of the world's resources by unbridled capitalism. And this was actually part of an actual submission by Bolivia to one of the COPs. They were making a submission on various points, and then at the end they said, well, in any case, we can't do anything about it unless we destroy capitalism. Or is it farming, livestock farming, as these Kiwis are saying? Many people have sympathy with that view, particularly in regard to New Zealand's emissions. Simplify it, stop eating meat. You've got a choice, save the climate or eat meat. If you are a post-colonialist inclined, you don't do simple, but roughly you can see the more or less the line there, neo-colonialism and imperialism. Or maybe it's Indigenous people who are the solution. A lot more emphasis on Indigenous people actually in the Paris Agreement and later. But what about degrowth? You've seen a lot about this recently. There's just a sense, it's no use talking about technology, you just have to stop consumption. So whereas one group of people would see growing population as a problem, another is just our consumption, our excessive consumption, that is the behaviour. Get off that, just get off that track. If you are a Republican, that's French, this slide was originally a presentation in France. If you're a Republican congressman, technology's there, technology will fix everything, and certainly bureaucrats, all these negotiators talking themselves silly, won't. And just to, it's a point I made in an interview on the radio, what we're doing with COPs latterly, we're sending the population of Ashburton somewhere in the world and expecting to save the planet with 35,000 people all crammed into one small place. This is the techno fixes. I won't go into this, but the various magical geoengineering solutions, as if you can't reduce your emissions enough. You know, you can shoot up giant mirrors in the sky, you can inject CO2 underground, iron filings in the ocean, water vapor going, there's all sorts of things which have been proposed. And this is an interesting one because this is an economist statement, the largest statement of economists in history, they say, with many Nobel Prize winners. January 2019, included in that was Amartya Sen, which was interesting, who's not exactly a raving free marketeer. A carbon tax offers the most cost-effective lever to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary. So what is, I mean, you're probably sympathetic to some of those views, but has any one of those views got to the core? In my view, they're all, none of them are entirely wrong. Some are more wrong than others. There is some truth in just about all of them, but the ones that may be more true, they're utopian. So it's just not a practical, not a practical solution to choose that simplification. So that's the challenge. I won't give you my own simplification, but it's certainly not loss and damage as came out from this COP. And incidentally, though it was portrayed as a great political success, nothing has been agreed. And this is just a quirk of these negotiations. There's a wonderful little footnote that says, right at the beginning of that decision, which is agreement on loss and damage, setting up a fund, it says, well, in plain English, it says more or less, well, we might have agreed in extremis to get an outcome from this COP, but don't think we're going to be agreeing with it any further when we discuss it all through next year. They set up a 24-country committee with 2 co-chairs, meetings all through the year, workshops, who are trying to get this thing set up in a year's time. Don't hold your breath on that one. Right. This, as it's Christmas, I thought this quote was actually rather appropriate. The climate energy challenge has become a Christmas tree on which we hang our own baubles, using it to advance agendas that are tangential rather than essential to deep decarbonisation. With, I think, reflecting on that, the climate change and lexicon is hundreds, if not thousands, of words long, and you've got a cause that you'd feel deeply about. Hitch it to the climate change wagon, which is sort of the most prominent and most high-profile issue going. Going to start on the segue to New Zealand. You know that forests have been a big issue in government policy recently, and there's been quite a few flip-flops. I think we first heard that we're going to be, we'll solve our problems with 1 billion trees, and then people were a little bit worried, well, hang on, do we really want to plaster the whole country with pine trees? What about rural employment? What about effect on local economy? What about biodiversity? So then the government decided, oh, actually, no, we don't think that's a good idea either, so we're going to just restrict these to native forests. I'll just go back. We're just going to restrict these to native forests. And then the forest owners say, well, hang on a minute, we've invested based on value in future trees, and then the iwi interests say, well, this is our land. We want to make money out of those trees. So the government's flip-flop back on that one. So pine trees are back on the agenda. But this is a good example from, and this is the real effect of climate policy on the economy. I'll go back one slide. This was in 2013. The units surrendered under the ETS. In other words, you have to pay for your emissions. What's going on here with like 90.7%, this is what was surrendered under the ETS, so theoretically helping New Zealand reduce its emissions. That was all hot air from Ukraine at around about 20 cents a tonne, whereas to make it worthwhile at the time to grow trees for carbon, you needed at least 15 New Zealand dollars a tonne, but that was the effect. And this is the effect on this guy, who had been planting all those seedlings, growing all those seedlings in the expectation that there would be a carbon price that would justify. So it just shows you how linked this all is. That was going to be my segue through to the discussion of, well, A, the science from Dave, and B, we'll get on to New Zealand policy.
Yeah, okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the warming aspects of climate change, the science aspects of climate change, talking about climate policy's ultimate aim. The ultimate aim of climate policy, according to the UN Framework Convention, is the stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The thing was, they didn't really have numbers on that when they agreed that back in 1992. That's from the Framework Convention, kind of the underpinning document of what the world thinks it's doing on climate change. But really, the ultimate aim of climate change will be determined by when people sort of stop working on it and where greenhouse gases tend to over time. And we don't actually have a strong control over that because it's future generations that will decide that. What it requires is close to net zero emissions of long-lived gases such as carbon dioxide and constant emissions or even declining emissions under some conditions of short-lived gases such as methane. And the temperature targets imply cumulative limits because there's a linear relationship. So a commitment to remain under any temperature target, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, whatever, is amounts to a commitment to stop emitting greenhouse gases, stop emitting carbon dioxide above some level, that is, get to net zero. And the timing, the details of the timing matter less than the total quantity of CO2 emitted. So in this slide, I used a climate model called FAIR, which was used by the IPCC, and I ran a whole bunch of emissions scenarios that I coloured by the cumulative emissions in the so that the light colours up here are a large amount of CO2 and the dark colours are a small amount of CO2. And what you see is that the details of the timing don't really matter. The concentrations kind of shake down over time, so they tend to a limit, because for those of you who like maths, you're integrating the area under this curve, and that's why you end up with the same value and concentrations. And then you end up with the same warming arising from that. So that's where the idea of net zero comes from, is that you don't flatten off this warming line until you get to zero on your emissions. Where current emissions come from, or current warming comes from, this is from the last IPCC report. This is chapter 7. I was an author on this one, on this chapter. We've had about 1 degrees warming from CO2, and it's the purple line, and the black line is the observations. That's observed warming. That's the total warming. That's the sum of all the contributions. The dominant term, far and away, and increasingly so, is carbon dioxide. The next largest term is actually aerosol cooling. So this is aerosols, tiny particles in the atmosphere, often they can be produced from being kicked up from dust, but one of the main sources is actually the combustion of coal, where sulfates, little sulfate impurities lie in there. They get kicked up into space through industrial pollution, coal burning, and so on, kicked up into the atmosphere, that is, and they actually offset the warming, but they only last a couple of weeks. Each individual particle only has a residence time of a couple of weeks in the atmosphere, but that actually amounts to offsetting about half a degree. Volcanoes are the spiky one here, and they can mask warming temporarily, and it's actually through the same sorts of effect as aerosols that they do that. In many cases, they are aerosols that get up into the stratosphere. So that's the big spikes downward, but that's a natural forcing. These are anthropogenic ones. And then the next largest term, of course, is methane. Nitrous oxide is 0.1 degree, and halogenated gases, industrial gases, basically 0.2 degrees. So that's where our current warming comes from. And pretty clearly, the thing that will stabilise the warming is getting the CO2 under control. And we expect to clean up the atmosphere over the next 50 years, and that will unmask warming that we've already committed to by burning CO2. How much warming we expect depends on the emission scenarios. I've used some old money here, some of the old scenarios from the 90s, because I thought they were interesting, and because they had a cumulative emissions slide back before there was a general realisation that this problem is all about, that warming is linear in cumulative emissions. So I just added a ruler using the transient climate response to cumulative emissions that gives you the warming associated with any given amount of cumulative emissions. And what you see is that under most scenarios, even the ones we talked about in the 90s, and early 2000s, you expect probably a bit less than 4 degrees of warming this century. There aren't many scenarios that give you much more warming than that. You actually have to make some strange choices about how future societies will behave to get above 4 or 5 degrees. We can talk about that if you're interested. But most of them, people say at the moment we're on course for somewhere around between 2.5 and 3 degrees with current policies as they are. Okay, so we have a commitment that some people read into the Kyoto Protocol, but not everyone. So the actual, sorry, not the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, I've had a long day. The Paris Agreement says we're going to remain well below 2 degrees and we'll continue to pursue efforts towards 1.5. Some people interpret this as a 1.5 degree target, though that's actually not what the text says. That would require, this is a slide from Glenn Peters, who's Director of Research at a large climate shop in Norway. That requires 8% per annum reductions, compounding, 8% per annum reductions in carbon dioxide emissions from now until 2050, which I think is that 8% compounding is the exponential curve here. But basically, you need to find some way of falling off a cliff, having the emissions fall off a cliff. At 8% per annum, COVID in 2020 knocked 6% off global CO2 emissions, which have since bounced back pretty much fully. So you need a COVID and a third with no rebound for 30 years to stay under 1.5 degrees. The world champs, over the last 15 years, the world champs of emissions reduction are the UK, which has achieved it through a combination of policy, industrial policy, pricing strategies, and a big dollop of offshoring their emissions through migration away from manufacturing and so on to the service economy. So importing emissions rather than having them accounted for in your own inventory. And they have reduced emissions at about 2.3% per annum over that 15-year period. So they're kind of the world champs at this, and they've had 2.3% emissions reductions, and we need 8% globally. So my analogy for that is like, it's like saying to Usain Bolt, well, you're very good effort, you ran the 100 meters in 9.59 seconds. Now you and this whole group of people have to average 3 seconds for the same event. So 1.5 degrees isn't going to happen. We have it, however, in our legislation, which I find a strange choice and a hostage to fortune. The world as a whole are moving towards net zero targets, but in general, they aren't pegging themselves, they aren't, kind of hanging that directly onto a temperature target. So Denmark says, and note the range of different interpretations here, or different phrasings, climate neutral by 2050. Now, to me, climate neutral means we are no longer affecting the climate, we're no longer increasing temperatures. Fiji net zero emissions by 2050. That could mean a range of things depending on what you mean by emissions. Finland, the government's decision to put Finland on a path towards achieving carbon neutrality by 2035. So whether that's carbon is in carbon dioxide, or carbon is in all greenhouse gases, or carbon is in only the greenhouse gases that involve carbon, I don't know. You could presumably argue about that. Iceland says carbon neutral for 2050, blah blah blah. So all of these guys, Norway, who I think are fairly sophisticated about some of these points about other gases, say climate neutrality. There's a range. The issue for New Zealand is that we have a target that, let me just move that thing down to there. New Zealand has a target that says that our compatible, that you set an emissions goal that is compatible with what the world needs to do to stay under 1.5 degrees. So if we take that to mean what is the global required emissions reduction rate to stay under 1.5 degrees, then it would be the blue line here in emissions. So focus on the blue line. Now imagine, so New Zealand is, less than 1% of emissions, or around about 1% of global emissions, depending on what you mean by emissions. Imagine 8 years go by and global emissions are still at 10 gigatons of carbon in 8 years' time. In that case, what the world needs to do is actually decline at the rate given by the orange curve to stay under 1.5 degrees. So you end up then having to steepen. Even if you were meeting your emissions reduction target that you set in 2020, the phrasing, compatible with what the world needs to do to stay under 1.5 degrees, the very vast majority of which is not determined by your actions but by those of others, means you have to live within it. You have to continue to tighten your belt and have your emissions fall even faster. And then another 8 years go by and there's no budget left because the world is, if the world continues to emit at 10 gigatons of carbon per annum, then there is no budget left. And you, even if you were doing what you said you would do, even if you were meeting your original 2020 target, what the world would have to do to stay under 1.5 degrees is then have zero carbon emissions. And so then instead of thinking that your carbon, your contribution of warming is going to look like the blue curve, it would end up actually having to look like the black curve. So you end up contributing less to warming because others are not doing their bit. This is sometimes called taking up the slack in some of the climate ethics literature. It seems a strange thing for a small country, small trading country with no CO2 industries to undertake, or few CO2 industries. So this is just walking you through that slide. So as long as you reduce emissions faster than the world as a whole, you keep allocating yourself an ever shrinking budget. That's the basic point. It doesn't really, the details don't turn on whether you stay at 10. The result turns on your line, your emissions reductions target being faster than what the world as a whole needs to do. Then you keep allocating yourself an ever-shrinking carbon budget. This is presumably why no one else does it this way. I raised this with researchers who work at the Science Policy Interface in Norway and the UK, and it's quite conspicuous that they did nothing like this. And the other problem, the other dimension, I think, that's really worth picking out in the carbon budget area is, this is a quote from Tom Schelling, who wrote a terrific piece, only a couple of parts of which have dated in the 1990s, Some Economics of Global Warming, where the current popular, he says, current popular expectations of any participation in greenhouse gas regime take the form of commitments to specified emissions reductions plans. So read that as emissions reductions plans. Below those of some specific year, like 1990 or 2000. This is about the Kyoto Protocol. The same logic applies to net zero targets. That you're setting this target about where your emissions are going to be 30 years down the track when you don't really know much about the rest of the global context, the economic context, the technological context for that choice. And he says, I cannot help believing that the adoption of such a commitment is an indication of insincerity. A serious proposal would specify policies, taxes, regulations, subsidies, programs like R&D accompanied by very uncertain estimates of their likely effects on emissions. And so this is where, by setting it from targets and future goals, grand visions, and then saying we'll do whatever we have to meet it, you've actually put the cart before the horse. And it's a totally unconvincing way to go about doing policy. Normally, so strategy is the art and science and craft of matching capabilities to aspirations. And in this case, what we have is aspirations that we have no idea how we're going to meet. And they're then trying, people are then bigging up our capabilities on the basis that we'll need to have the capabilities expand to match the aspirations, but it's not obvious that that's an easy thing to do. And the world is littered with examples of strategic overreach where people's aspirations, such as Napoleon's in Russia, for instance, easily outran their capabilities and calamity ensued. That's really the main point I wanted to make, that I think there are major problems in how we've structured our intentions to, our approaches to carbon budgets. This is all beyond, because it's all referring to things that are already agreed in legislation, it's a little beyond what the Climate Change Commission can do. In any case, they're not really an independent body. They're ministerial appointees responding to queries from the minister, who knows, where the thorny issues are buried. So they can't it's not entirely their fault. They can't really address this. This is just a point that not all greenhouse gases are the same. Cumulative emissions, so the long-lived gases, the warming goes as the area under the curve of the emissions. So if you have increase in carbon dioxide emissions, you have accelerating warming. If you have constant CO2 emissions, you have linearly increasing warming. If you have falling CO2 emissions, you have slowly decreasing warming. Whereas short-lived gases, the warming just follows what the emissions are doing. And this is why we should regulate them separately, why we regulate pollutants that break down, like alcohol, in our bloodstream differently from how we regulate lead and mercury, which don't break down in our bloodstream. We have this peculiar way of pretending that these things are exchangeable, using CO2 equivalents, which is a really bad idea that doesn't really work very well. And one of the reasons it doesn't work, I might finish on the slide actually, is because if you take 1 year's emissions of methane in the over 6 or 7 year period, this year's emissions of methane result in more warming than this year's emissions of carbon dioxide. But this year's emissions of methane matter less and less over time as time goes by, as that methane breaks down. Whereas this year's emissions of CO2 are a permanent legacy for the climate. And that is the only gas, really, of which that is true. Okay. And then you can have a conversation about what level of warming we want, which is actually how I think we should probably structure our conversations. I think we've kind of already done this by having a two-basket approach policy. What level of emissions reductions are required to prevent any further warming from the three main gases? You need negative emissions or zero emissions immediately from CO2. negative or zero emissions immediately from nitrous oxide, and you can maintain 99.7% per annum of the previous year's emissions for methane and not cause further warming. So, so there's a big difference between these, and that's why it's important to treat these differently. I've got other slides if anybody's interested in that stuff. What have I got? Yeah. But I think I'll leave it there.
Dave, can you hear?
Yeah.
Can you just on your last point on methane, you decrease it by 0.3% per annum, and you're at climate neutrality. But I mean, I think the discussion here is okay, that's fine, but we want methane to go down. So can you talk about the potential for when you reduce methane, how much reduction can we end up in global to final global temperature? What's the scale?
So if you do that, then basically what you could get the same temperature outcome. So this is actually was the next slide. These are both 1.5 degree scenarios, the red and the blue one. In the reds, you notice that both of them have to get at some point carbon dioxide, fossil carbon emissions to zero, right? That's the necessary condition for stopping warming. It's almost sufficient. But whether or not you leave more warming space for higher methane emissions, which is what the red curve does, or you reduce methane and then you can emit a bit more CO2 for the same temperature, which is what the blue curve does. That's the way in which they're exchangeable. But they're constrained by the fact that globally you've only got 0.3 degrees of methane, of warming associated with methane. You're getting that almost per decade from CO2 now. So you could go really big on methane. You can buy down some of that methane, that warming from methane. That's a good thing if it's not coming at the expense of effort on CO2. But the increment, the decadal increment on the CO2 is almost as large as the total warming from methane. Okay, can I stop there?
The reason for mentioning all those COPs to start with was just to acknowledge that's sort of the way that the world and public opinion tends to focus. But that is actually now very much a lowest common denominator, and there's an awful lot that is actually happening despite the COPs, and massive change in attitudes and action from business, from governments, from cities, from subnational entities, and a lot focused on the sort of energy transition, a lot focused on lower carbon footprint. So in fact, the Paris Agreement was a good pivot to a new, more robust global framework, and we don't need people in these. We don't need thousands of people every year negotiating minutiae to enable this stuff to happen. And I'll go back to what my simplification of all those people, all those different options. My simplification I mentioned on the radio. How do we know if we're going to be successful? Well, the key, for me, the key issue is how fast are the 20 largest economies in the world going to make the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. They represent about 85% of global emissions. That's actually that's the thing, that's the key critical factor for when and how high as global temperature is going to stabilize. So, and for me, what I saw, one useful thing I saw coming out of that COP was nothing to do with the COP itself. It was just an announcement that people make these announcements at the COP. It's like your big trade fair show and tell. The Americans came up, the Biden administration, out of their $300 billion that they're putting in for their climate work, this concept of an energy transition accelerator. And that's the concept of that is it's government with the private sector working in developing countries to do exactly to accelerate the transition from fossils to renewables. And to my mind, that was right on the button for what action has to happen. Whereas the loss and damage thing, frankly, was completely peripheral.
So that's that's an initiative that was not dependent on those negotiations, but having had those very clear principles and targets in the Paris Agreement, they are actually proving something against which you can align your own policies, and you don't need governments to tell you how to do that. So I think that's, and the acceleration of take-up in technologies, they're to me are much more positive signals than you get by looking at the disastrous negotiations, which are absolutely the worst. And I've done negotiations for 30 plus years, and the climate negotiations are the worst, by far the worst example of an international negotiation ever. Most of the key decisions which led to the Paris Agreement were actually decisions taken despite the climate negotiators, despite the climate negotiation, rather than in the negotiation. So we could get on to the, do we want to, we can, we're going to make this the rest of the conversation, so I mean, what Dave and I were writing about was, the New Zealand government, how it was positioning our policy. And just very quickly, under Paris, you all have to make a contribution. This very last, the semantics of contribution are fascinating because it's a word that reconciles commitment, which is legally binding, and action, which is not legally binding. The word contribution is it's universal. Everyone has to make a contribution, but it's ambiguous as whether it's legally binding or not. Our contribution is to, at the moment, it's to halve our emissions by 2030, except that it isn't, because only about, the modelling shows only about 30% of that would be done in New Zealand. The rest, the other 70%, requires offshore mitigation, and the Climate Commission itself calculated on a pretty conservative assumption about carbon price that is a cost to New Zealand economy of $30+ billion over the next 8 years. And that was the point that struck Dave and me, and that we wrote about in this series for Business Desk. And I think that the diagnosis of what went wrong there is that, as Dave really outlined, unlike every other government which decided, okay, let's see how far we can go, how much can we reduce our emissions by, look at all our different sectors, work out what we can do, shove that target in as our international target. But New Zealand took a very quirky approach, started from the top, started from some global scenarios, and sort of said, oh, okay, well, we'll use that as the base, the global scenario, which is put forward by the IPCC, never intended to be applied to a country. We'll use that as the base, but because we're a rich country, we need to go even further, and we need to get right down towards align ourselves with 1.5 degrees, and we've been right at the lowest quartile of emissions under that IPCC. So we sort of ended up in that top-down word, and that's basically where we're currently at. I mean, neither Dave nor I nor most people think that $30 billion is sustainable against calls from education, health, social welfare, you name it, over the next 8 years. So it's an interesting conundrum, but it's been a good example, I think, well, a bad example of a public policy process, because it's clear that there was no, I mean, there was that item, you find that $30 billion if you plough your way through the Climate Commission report on about page 197, you'll see it there, but there's been absolutely no discussion about it. So just set a bit of a context, both a little bit more optimism on what is happening internationally, and just a bit of explanation as to why we wrote about where the New Zealand situation got to.
So the $30 billion just buys it, means we don't have to do too much reduction of emissions.
No, I mean under the Kyoto Protocol, that system of carbon trading was introduced because only developed countries, only rich countries had commitments. So the idea was, okay, do what you can, but the planet doesn't care where emissions happen. So pay some other countries to reduce them, and you can basically pay them and offset your emissions that way. Yeah, that was it.
But one of the problems with the 30 billion is that it just doesn't get us on the road of decarbonising our own economy, and you would have to actually keep paying that, because you would be paying for the emission reductions that you didn't make, and then you would have to be paying for the ones that you are making in the next period if you wanted to keep falling at the same rate. And so it doesn't really get you, the 30 billion overseas doesn't really help you with your decarbonisation journey. and there are these other things like loss and damage where they may persist, they may become a big deal, and there is a sense in which I think the arguments for helping the Pacific are stronger on the pure ethical arguments associated with climate change are much stronger in a loss and damage sense for compensating the Pacific than they are for helping them on the decarbonisation journey, even though it's actually the
We've lost you, Dave.
The bad news, the 30 billion was the direct cost of what the Commission estimate, direct cost of purchasing, however we did it through investment or buying carbon credits, on a non-existent international market. We haven't created the market yet, plus the indirect cost of all that money being invested offshore and not in the New Zealand economy. And I think if you like, that it's a consequence of this obsession with, I'll use the word obsession, this obsession with targets, rather than, I think, the much more healthy and operational way to see things should be transitions. Because when you talk about transition, you know where you're transitioning to net zero, and it's a more dynamic thing. And rather than setting up unrealistic targets and getting praise from the world for being world leading, seeing how far and fast you can transition each sector of your economy, I think is a much more sound way of doing it. And I would separate out the aspect of assistance to developing countries out of that market altogether. And we want to do things for the Pacific. What Dave and I were saying is much more effective. Go and talk to the Pacific Islands directly. What do they want? Use that, not have something that we have to offset against our own emissions. So anyway, there are different ways of doing things, but that's I think the main dilemma that we've got ourselves into.
Yeah, questions.
A question for you, Adrian, and taking your point about the importance of what the major economies do, and in light of your previous ambassadorial roles, do you think that the energy crisis in Europe and the sky-high prices they face will galvanise serious action towards decarbonisation there? Because in many ways it is a stonking great carbon tax that they're facing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think it's highlighted, certainly what this has highlighted is all this wonderful talk about getting to net zero. What we've realised is how, even some of the best performing economies, how dependent they still are on fossil fuels. But I think if you wanted a single means of hastening the shift to renewables, Vladimir Putin is actually it. I think that there's there are many lives being lost, but what's that? Sorry.
Not if he sells it elsewhere.
Well, no, but that means that those countries, at least those countries that were purchasing, will be hastening their shift. And then, as things move forward, then the economics shift too. And then the economics have shifted hugely on. When I first started the negotiations in 2005, reducing emissions, in other words, shifting off fossil fuels, was a cost. And it was, how do you share out this cost? Well, that's no longer, that paradigm is no longer true. Maybe true for some countries, but for New Zealand, if you want to set up a new power station, you're not going to build a coal-fired one. You're going to do wind or solar or geothermal.
And isn't that what the Europeans need to do at pace and at scale?
And probably, I think nuclear will return, probably in a much better shape than previously.
Thanks, thanks, Adrian and Dave. Accept that, just to get credits to put things you didn't do. So it's fatuous politically to think that might be a solution.
Well, I think there's really bad news that nobody seems to realise is that 30 billion is not a purchase, it's a loan. Yeah. Because at the end of the commitment, at the end of that period, if we haven't reduced our emissions, we're going to have to re-buy all that stuff again. But I don't think anybody really thinks it's sustainable. I think there's two things there going. One is this desire to be a world leader. If you want to know, why is it so difficult for us to have
the fear is that we can't get a respectable number in terms of what percentage we reduce our emissions by. That goes back partly to the question of the wrong measurement, of the poor measurement of emissions, but it also goes right back to two features of our economy. One, already a very high percentage of renewable electricity, and B, agriculture being such a large proportion of our emissions. Both of those factors, which we're in a way, our emissions per unit of production that was pretty respectable in both those, but both of those factors mean it's much harder for New Zealand to do a percentage X reduction. That's why, to be respectable, there's been this feeling that we need to have that overseas component. And every other country, as I said, they've looked at what they can do. One of the point we made in that article was that the most common burden sharing principle all through my time in the negotiations has been the cost to your economy of making those reductions. You've had these McKinsey curves showing the cost of increasing reductions in CO2. That has been an accepted burden sharing principle, but the Commission just completely ignored it. To the Commission, and the government adopted the recommendations, the only thing that was relevant was that headline number. And the only significance of the cost, the domestic thing, was how much we could do it at home, and the Commission has estimated that, and all the rest simply has to be done abroad. There was no consideration whatsoever of the cost of the economy. There was a little, I know you're an ex-Treasury person, in the Cabinet papers, a plaintive note from the Treasury saying, this looks like way more expensive for New Zealand than for other countries, and there's been no analysis, and what about some consultation? And MB said there's been no analysis and we need some consultation. MPI wasn't happy, but what the Cabinet did was they must have said, well, thank you very much, we're going to add 5% more to the target because we want to be world leaders. So,
I think the part of the problem there is that you have a minister outside Cabinet where the other Cabinet members won't necessarily feel bound by the political decisions he makes, but he's able to impose costs on the economy because nobody's really kind of watching and thinking, well, that's on us. I think the structure of having a minister outside Cabinet be able to promise checks of $30 billion and all the rest of this stuff there hasn't been enough scrutiny and discussion of it. And the other thing is the NGOs will never give New Zealand credit no matter what we do, because that's just misinterpreting how those things work. If you look at the Fossil of the Day Award, which is one of the ways they try and shame countries, in the COPs, it's not often European economies that get shamed. It's always Australia, New Zealand, Japan, USA, maybe the oil petro states, maybe the odd more kind of market liberal European state, but it's hardly ever Germany, because most of these things are headquartered intellectually. The analytics companies from which they draw their information are headquartered there, and they don't buy the hand that feeds them. So it doesn't really, if you look up what other countries think about nuclear-free leadership, you'll find that a lot of them don't really tell our story at all and don't regard New Zealand as being a particularly important player in the nuclear-free story. And I think that's actually that was what occurred to me when Jacinda Ardern said that this was our nuclear-free moment. I thought, well, it could well be. We could choose to hang our hat on something that no one else really notices, because we don't control the narrative. And that's why I think choosing a headline, basing our policy on a headline number for some sort of spectacular, we were the one who took on the biggest burden title, is a particularly bad way to structure policy.
There's another piece of good news. There is an exit strategy. There will need to be an exit strategy from this, and there is one. It's not. It will need a bit of diplomacy, but there's, I think there's a way out. There's a way out of where we've got ourselves into.
Which is?
Oh, you need to read our business text. Well, no, I mean the problem was that they didn't. From the public policy point of view,
I think Dave and I have explained how we got to where we were, and very much what we concluded when we went through all the documents was this was not careful analysis of and weighing up of different options and alternatives for government and saying, look, government, pros, cons, pros, cons, pros, cons, now you decide. It was, we have found the one true way, and the nature of a lot of that material, and there's lots of errors in it, it was more, we concluded, advocacy of a position rather than analysis of plus and minuses, and analysis for government then to take the decision. I mean, clearly there were politics all going on, and there's been a very, very small cohort of sort of expert advice feeding into that. And I mean, I'm quite convinced that you know, reason will prevail, and we'll have something much more rational. Which, what we also point to, what we need to is focus on our own. You know, do more. I mean, I think a lot of New Zealanders are not very happy about only doing a very modest amount of reductions at home. Do some more at home and focus more on that.
Thanks, Adrian. As a public sector antique, you sort of answered my obvious question, which is where's the public sector intellectual powerhouse that challenges ministers? We don't have one in justice because, you know, someone got killed last week, so we're now going to have a new justice policy, etc. But given that we've got there, I mean, we went also into a pandemic without any epidemiologists in the Ministry of Health because someone 20 years before decided we didn't need them, and we're lucky we had some university ones. What's going to come? And, you know, you've suggested that the Climate Change Commission isn't probably as perfect as we'd hope it to be. Where's the intellectual grunt, the analytical capability that we need for the next 20 years that's actually going to lead this? We can't have wishy-washy little 5-minute wonders that join ministers' offices, party hacks for a while, doing this sort of stuff.
Lena, I'm taking this as a rhetorical question.
Yeah. Well, but
Dave might have an answer.
Where's the next?
Well,
what do we do in the next 20 years?
Name a thought leader amongst the New Zealand civil service. Name a visionary thought leader amongst the New Zealand civil service currently. Dave?
I'm out of date.
In the area of climate change,
Anywhere.
Well, it's a bit unfair in the sense that they can't really speak up in the public.
They used to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think
I found Jeff Lewis's stuff when he was at Prodcom doing low emission stuff. That was pretty good. And Simon Upton, they both brave enough to take on, you know, to think a bit differently and challenge at least some parts of the kind of that small cabal of people that you were talking about. So I probably, yeah, they both had good games, I think. But I'm trying to be positive.
no, but I mean, it's a good example, I think. I mean, Simon, of course, isn't a civil servant, but he came up with some original thinking about, which was related to both the methane issue and then the forest issue that I put that slide up about. He started speculating, well, hang on, forests are, they're not that long-lived, you know, and they're subject to various vagaries of disease and fire and things, and after 30 years, you know, they're no longer absorbing the carbon so much. So wonder, would that be a better match for offsetting methane emissions? Well, he tentatively said that, or it must have been about 4 or 5 years ago. He got slapped back by the establishment, you know, this is unwanted, unhelpful, but he's come back again with a much more considered report, and he's back to the charge. So that's an example of some good thinking, actually, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Notwithstanding the importance of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, the real problem seems to be temperature. Removing CO2 isn't going to benefit anybody alive today. But reducing temperature by increasing albedo, increasing aerosols, sun shading, would that not be a better expenditure of money in the shorter term? Thank you.
No, I don't think so. I don't. One, I disagree that removing CO2 from the atmosphere would benefit people alive today. That would definitely benefit young people. It would disproportionately benefit people in the developing world as well. Two, I don't know any atmospheric physicists who don't work in the area of solar radiation management, who think that solar radiation management, which is putting particles up into the atmosphere and letting them bounce out sunlight so that so that less sunlight makes it down to the earth in the first place, and using that to tune the temperatures. I don't know anybody who doesn't work in that area who thinks it's a good idea, because atmospheric radiation is a two-stream thing. There's solar radiation coming in, there's long-wave radiation going out, and having a short-wave approach, short-wave solution to a long-wave problem probably doesn't work, and the climate would do funny things that we don't fully understand in response. One thing in particular is you change rainfall. My understanding is you change rainfall substantially either in India or in China, both of which depend on the Himalayan plateau for their rainfall. So even if you solve the temperature problem, or you address the temperature problem through solar radiation management, you're still left with a hydrological problem, which is also, water's pretty fundamental to human life and other life.
We've got time for one last question. Any others coming through? Yep. Can you just stand up and say who you are?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora koutou, I'm Matt. Thanks, Adrian and Dave. I'm really curious to hear about we talked a little bit about the government's plans to offset internationally, and I think you mentioned in your pie graph a large proportion of hot air credits that were purchased. Can you expand on that around, how helpful these credits are and how they're reducing global emissions? And kind of a second-pronged thing, which was mentioned as well, is carbon pricing and what the appetite of countries internationally is on setting a price on carbon so that it can perhaps be better factored into their consumption patterns. Because I'm not sure whether the ETS takes into account internal consumption.
On your second point, is precisely what those economists were saying, what those 3,500 economists were saying. Global carbon price is what you need. The Europeans are looking at something called a CBAM, which is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And what they're saying is, well, we've got a carbon price. So if anyone wants to export stuff to us, we're going to check on their carbon price, and they're going to be taxed on the differential. It's only it won't touch agriculture, because their agriculture doesn't have a carbon price, but that's their plan. I see it. I think that there could be sort of coalitions of the willing, where countries will agree amongst themselves, maybe to liberalise trade, but providing that they respect, a comparable carbon price, or coalitions of the willing. On your point about carbon markets, now we've got 35 minutes. No, just briefly though. So the concept under Kyoto was, as I said, the planet doesn't, it's only for developed countries. Rich countries have to reduce emissions. The planet doesn't care where they're reduced, so let's make it so that you can actually pay for a project in a developing country, and they can get, say, a new renewable energy plant, and you can have the credits from that. You pay for it. I mean, that was the whole concept. But what countries had, who were in the Kyoto Protocol, they had an allocation of called assigned amount units. And in the case of Ukraine and all of Eastern Europe, it got its allocation of assigned amount. It's how much it's allowed to emit. And if you get under that, you can sell the surplus. So what happened was that was before the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. So all these Eastern Europe countries were led with this massive amount of carbon units that they didn't need because their economies all collapsed. So it was perfectly legal. Sell it. So they were selling it, but there was so much of it around that instead of $15, $20, the price got down. Those units were being bought at 20 cents a tonne. So that's the origin of that's why they call it hot air, and absolutely nothing for the climate. And the second problem was the main mechanism under Kyoto was called the clean development mechanism, concept of rolling out renewables to developing countries. Guess who benefited overwhelmingly from the clean development mechanism? Any ideas? China, India, Brazil. Economic logic, but morally questionable. So
that was, I mean, it's a good idea. They tested, test out, but that's been highly controversial. I mean, a lot of developing countries are dead against carbon markets. That there was a lot of fraud going on, and it's questionable how many real emissions reductions were made because of those carbon markets. You had a key principle called additionality. You couldn't fund something that they would have done anyway. Well, how can you prove that? So I think, to my mind, they were, they may have a role, but and you can guarantee that if we put all our eggs in the UN basket, the UN negotiators basket, you'll have a diabolically complicated administrative system. So the much better prospect is what we call coalitions of the willing, and we're actually working with some countries in the Asia-Pacific region to create a sort of regional carbon market. We could partner up with countries who, you need to have a bit of integrity and governance to make these things work. One country that Motu was doing some work with was Colombia, who've got pretty good integrity and pretty good targets and stuff. So potentially you could see a market link up there. And also, even with developed countries linking up their ETSs.
Dave, do you want to just finish off?
Yeah, thanks. Border stuff is going to be hard no matter what. The EU, ironically, given their fondness for protection, were complaining about Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, that this might suck low carbon firms over the United States and pull them out of Europe. Now, as a free market kind of guy, I like that. I think that's great. If people are competing for the same brains and for the, perhaps that's not what I'm supposed to say to the Fabians, but like the idea that people are competing for smart, low carbon companies is got to be a good thing. The cross-border harmonisation of regulations is going to be hard. That's an example. The coalitions of the willing will be tough no matter what. And there's a sense in which the more you do at home, the less exposed you are to that. So our price collapsed because we were linked to the EU ETS. If we go and do the same again through forestry policy, where 70% of our policy is based on trees somewhere else, we're going to be again exposed to whatever policy pathologies and price pathologies arise as a consequence of that. And I think it's another reason why the more we do at home, the better. And the final point I'd make is just about the least popular paper I've ever written was with Cameron Hepburn from Oxford, on where we plotted emissions per capita, economy size, and the corruption perceptions index. And the basic point was that these investments, these large pots of money, are going to be investments from countries which are perceived to be well governed, to purchase mitigation in countries that are perceived not to be. And this kind of bears on Adrian's point about the CDM. There were firms in India that created gases with horribly high global warming potentials just to incinerate them. There was no economic case for these firms to exist. They did so to harvest the money from the CDM credits they could get as a result. And that's the kind of thing that can happen if you don't design a system well. And I would also say it's the kind of system, the kind of thing that can happen if you have a single basket approach and you're comparing things that just shouldn't be compared. But I've got to go cook dinner now. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks very much, David. And thanks very much, Adrian. And that's the Fabians for the year.